In my program yesterday, I discussed an attempt by the Ukrainians in the aftermath of the battles of Avdiivka and various other problems that they're having on the battlefronts, and in advance of Sunday's elections in Russia, to launch an attack on Russian territory with attempts by Ukrainian troops to enter Kursk and Belgorod regions of Russia and to occupy certain villages there. And on the basis of very incomplete information provided by the Russian Defense Ministry, I said that as of yesterday, it looked as if the attack had been unsuccessful and had been repelled with significant losses. Well, over the next couple of hours, we started receiving updates from the Russian Defense Ministry, and what they suggest is a story of disaster, of a Ukrainian operation which does not appear to have been particularly well planned and which appears to have ended in complete disaster. Now, I ought to say that, again, I am relying on Russian sources to discuss what happened, in large part because there is a dearth of information about this operation from the Ukrainian side. There's been all sorts of reports by Ukrainian supporters, commentators, reporters on Twitter X, on all sorts of other places, claiming that the Ukrainians captured several villages, occupied Russian territory, that kind of thing. These claims are verifiably untrue. But so far as I can see, the Ukrainian authorities are saying very little about this affair, and the Western media, or at least the British media, and in truth the American media, have largely ignored it. Now, when that happens, two consequences follow, at least for me. The first is that I'm driven back to taking my information essentially from the Russians. That is one. And the second is that it reinforces my belief that what happened was a complete disaster on the part of the Ukrainians, which is why they don't want to talk about it and why the Western media doesn't want to talk about it either. Anyway, let me first of all go to what the Russians are saying. And at 20:05 Moscow time, yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry provided us with a comprehensive report, which I'm now going to read. In the morning, the armed forces of the Russian Federation, along with the border service of the Federal Security Service, thwarted the Kiev regime's attempt to enter the territory of the Russian Federation in Belgorod and Kursk regions. At around 0300 Moscow time, after intensive shelling of civilian settlements, the Ukrainian formations, supported by tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, attempted to assault the territory of the Russian Federation at the same time from three directions near Odnorobovka, Nekhoteevka, and Spodaryushino. These all being places in Belgorod region. All the attacks launched by Ukrainian formations were repelled by the selfless action of Russian servicemen. Aviation, missile troops, and artillery delivered strikes at the enemy. Up to 60 Ukrainian troops and 4 pickup trucks have been neutralized near Odnorobovka. On the borderline in Ukraine, close to Nekhoteevka, which is in Belgorod region, Russian aerospace forces, and by the way, we've got reason to think that these were helicopter gunships. This is not something that the Defense Ministry says. Artillery and Lancet unmanned aerial vehicles eliminated up to 45 Ukrainian troops, 2 tanks, and 2 armored personnel carriers. On the borderlines in Ukraine, close to Spodoryushino, Belgorod region, competent actions of state bordering border covering units, operational, tactical, and army aviation strikes using the Vichr anti-tank guided missile. Now, that is a missile used principally by Kamov 52 helicopter gunships, which is why I think they were probably operating in the area. But as I said, we see no pictures. And I should say that other Russian aircraft are capable of carrying these kind of missiles as well. But anyway, tactical army aviation strikes using the Vichr anti-tank guided missile system eliminated more than 100 Ukrainian troops, 5 tanks, 3 US-made Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 2 motor vehicles moving towards the state border. Another counter-obstacle vehicle was hit by a mine. Moreover, from 0800 to 0825, 4 attacks of Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups attempting to enter the border territory near Tetkino in Kursk region were repelled. As a result of active operations by the border units, the Zapar group of forces and the Russian Federal Security Service, that's the FSB, Ukrainian troops of the Kiev regime have been driven back. The enemy lost 235 troops killed, 7 tanks, 3 US-made Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and 2 armoured personnel carriers. There have been no violations of the state border. Now, that is a story of Ukrainian disaster. Now, is it true? Well, the first thing to say is that the Ukrainians have, or at least some people on the Ukrainian side, commentators, reporters, those sort of people, have claimed that some of these villages on the border were indeed captured. And there's been specific claims about a village called Tetkino. However, sometime after the Russian Defense Ministry, as I understand it, published this report, Russian journalist arrived in Tetkino with a film crew. He was able to move around. He found no Ukrainian troops there. So it is clear that Tetkino is under complete Russian control. And it seems there have also been film reports from all of the other villages that the Russians are referring to here, which do indeed seem to have been the villages that the Ukrainians sought to attack and capture. And again, it is clear that the Russians are in secure control of all of them. So, a major Ukrainian attack, and it entirely failed. None of the villages were captured. But perhaps the most striking thing is to look at the losses the Russians say they inflicted on the Ukrainians over the course of this affair. The penultimate paragraph of the Russian Defense Ministry's report reads, the enemy lost 234 troops. Well, of course, the Russian Defense Ministry always says militants, but let's say troops, killed. Now, as I've discussed, when the Russian Defense Ministry provides its updates and tells us about Ukrainian troops who have been lost or eliminated, it is clear from reading carefully what the Russian Defense Ministry says that these casualty reports of Ukrainian losses, which it is reporting, are of men killed, Ukrainian men killed and wounded. This report specifically says that 234 Ukrainian troops were killed. So, killed outright. That is half a battalion's worth of troops. Now, there are reports circulating on the internet, the Russian part of the internet, I should say, that all kinds of ambulances have been whizzing between this border region and Kharkiv with the wounded, the Ukrainian wounded from this operation. So if we assume that 234 troops were indeed killed, and we have no information to contradict that claim, and probably most of these men were killed either on Russian territory or on Russian-controlled territory, or they were killed in Russian air and missile strikes and drone strikes on Ukrainian formations, and the Russians were presumably able to keep careful track on what was going on. And of course, there's also the issue of radio intercepts. Anyway, if we assume that this figure of 234 men killed is correct, then it is likely that at least as many men have been wounded and injured as well, which would mean that Ukraine has lost an entire battalion of troops as a result of this ill-conceived operation. And the equipment losses also appear to have been very high. 7 tanks, and there's pictures of some of these tanks which have been destroyed, 3 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and 2 armoured personnel carriers. Now, on the issue of the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, again, no comment or contradiction from the Ukrainians about this, no comment about this on the US side, but just to say again that here we see the Ukrainians using American equipment, according to the Russians at least, to attack territory that is universally recognized as Russian. The United States, President Biden himself, have insisted at various times that the equipment the United States supplies to Ukraine is for defense only. It is not intended, it is not permitted for it to be used for attacks on Russia proper. I think that claim has become increasingly threadbare as this war has ground on. We had, of course, just a few weeks ago, the report in the New York Times about the CIA bases in Ukraine, in which it's clear that all kinds of operations were being launched across the border. And these preceded the start of the special military operation. But anyway, put all that aside, here we see the Russians again claim that American infantry fighting vehicles, 3 of them, were used in this operation and were destroyed. So, just saying. So, a disastrous affair. And in the hours which followed, Ukraine launched what I think is its single biggest ever drone strike against Russia. And again, we've had a report about it from the Russian Defense Ministry. In fact, there's been multiple reports, but there was one published at earlier this morning at 09:38 Moscow time, which provides a brief summary. Last night and in the morning of 13th March, the Russian armed forces foiled attempts by the Kiev regime to launch attacks using fixed-wing drones against the facilities in the Russian Federation. 58 drones have been intercepted and destroyed by alerted air defense systems over Belgorod, 11 drones, Bryansk, 8 drones, Voronezh, 29 drones, Kursk, 8 drones, Leningrad, 1 drone, and Ryazan, 1 drone. 58 drones, and they're the ones that the Russians claim that they intercepted. Probably others were used as well. There's been some attempts, by the way, to claim that this huge fleet of drones that the Ukrainians launched against Russia are the Ukrainian equivalents of the Geran 2 drones that the Russians use. I've seen pictures of some of these drones, and I have to say they don't look to me anywhere near as refined a product as the Geran 2 drone, which has apparently been modernized and will shortly enter service with a jet engine. But anyway, never mind. I'm not going to get sidetracked into a discussion of drones. Huge drone strike by Ukraine over the course of last night and early this morning. And it is clear to me, at least, that this drone strike was pre-planned and pre-prepared, obviously, but almost certainly was intended to be conducted in parallel with what the Ukrainians expected would be a successful operation to capture at least some villages on Russian territory. Now, we have information about some of these Ukrainian military units that carried out this absolutely disastrous attack on the Russian villages. And this has been provided through drone footage, very uninformative drone footage, by the way, that these units have released, these units that carried out this attack from the Ukrainian side have released of these attacks on these villages, and they purport to identify the units that were carrying out these attacks in these three locations in Kursk and Belgorod regions as dissident Russian formations. They come with curious names: the Russian Defense Force or the Siberian Defense Force or whatever. They were clearly intended to be, or at least appear to be, dissident Russian units. And of course, this repeats a ploy that the Ukrainians used in May of last year, shortly after the fall of Bakhmut, when they carried out operations of the same kind in roughly the same area of the border. And there was, again, a pretense that these weren't really Ukrainian troops at all, but Russian dissident troops. And, well, looking back, one can see a sort of pattern. The attacks in May in Belgorod region, which were ultimately unsuccessful, but not so immediately and catastrophically unsuccessful as these latest attacks have been. Anyway, those attacks in May, I've come to think, were intended in some way to set the scene for the Prigozhin mutiny that took place the following month. I think it is now fairly well established that the Ukrainians and the Western powers had got wind that something was coming. There's still a huge amount of speculation about whether Prigozhin was in some way in contact with the Ukrainians and what kind of discussions he might have been having with the Ukrainians. Again, I'm not going to explore that further in this program. But anyway, at that time, the public quarrel between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry was taking place in the most cacophonous way. And there was all kinds of reports and suggestions already circulating in the Western media that some kind of event was coming. And of course, beyond that, the Ukrainians were intending to launch their big offensive in Zaporozhye region on the 4th of June. So these attacks by purportedly dissident Russian formations last year were partly intended, I am sure, to try to establish some kind of foothold, obviously, on Russian territory, but also in some way, maybe, to intensify the hope of a political crisis in Moscow. And this attack, this latest attack, I think it's something like the same thing. Again, one sees the feverish mind of Ukraine's military intelligence chief, Kila Budanov, largely behind these kind of operations. Though, again, I'm sure that Western officials, at least some of them, must have known that something like this was coming. Anyway, the intent surely was to disrupt the Russian elections on Sunday, establish some kind of presence on Russian territory on the eve of those elections, pretend that this was a dissident, anti-Putin Russian formation that had managed to gain control of a few villages of what would then be referred to as Free Russia. And then, of course, you'd have this huge drone attack right across Russia in all kinds of places, also intended to reinforce the feeling, the sense for Russians on the eve of the election that President Putin and his government were losing control of the situation. It's very much in the style of what Budanov has been trying to do now. Well, ever since the special military operation began, but increasingly and mostly over the last year or so. Well, as we see, it failed catastrophically. The attack on the villages was completely unsuccessful. In fact, disastrously unsuccessful. And from what I can tell, so overall was the drone attack. Russian air defenses are on a completely different level from those of Ukraine. I get the sense that the Russians anyway probably were expecting a drone attack of this kind. I wonder whether perhaps they might have had some idea of the direction that some of these drones would take. Obviously, some drones did slip through. One in particular, or perhaps two, hit an oil refinery in Ryazan. But overall, the Russians seem to have managed, as they claim, to have shot down the vast majority of these drones. And consider where the bulk of these attacks took place. The largest single concentration of Ukrainian drones was on the city of Voronezh, which is located not so far from the state border, the Ukrainian and internationally recognized state border. And I wonder whether the Ukrainians were looking for some way of disrupting Russian activity there. Maybe they have established that there's a large concentration of Russian troops and communications facilities in Voronezh, who knows? But also they appear to have attempted to hit Belgorod, again, the nearest big city to the villages that were attacked, with 11 drones. It doesn't appear to have been a successful enterprise at all. Now, there are also some reports that a Ukrainian drone tried to strike at a Russian nuclear power station in Rostov, but was brought down. Curiously, the Russian Defense Ministry hasn't mentioned this in this particular statement, but of course, if it did, well, if there was such an attack, and apparently there is film of it, apparently it was unsuccessful. The drone was brought down. So anyway, one way or the other, the attack overall appears to have failed. Some drones got through, but the damage done was insignificant. I would add that not only is it the case that the Russian air defenses are of a completely different level of sophistication from those of Ukraine, with vastly greater depth in terms of missiles and anti-tank guns and electronic jamming systems than those that Ukraine can bring to bear when it is attacked by uranium-2 drones. But beyond that, Russia, of course, is the biggest country by far in the world. Launching drone attacks against Russia, almost by definition, is going to have only an insignificant effect on what takes place over this enormous country. So the whole conception behind these drone attacks, if they're intended to have some military instead of psychological purpose, is obviously wrong. You're not going to be able to launch successful drone attacks simultaneously in places as far afield as the Urals and the Far East, where of course there are also major industrial and military plants, and in Moscow and in Western Russia. It simply isn't a practical option. And of course the fact that these drones have to travel very large distances even to reach their targets in central and western Russia, already makes it much more likely that the very sophisticated Russian air defense system will be able to pick them up on its radar and other surveillance equipment and be able to track them and bring them down before they reach their targets. So anyway, an unsuccessful night on the part of the Ukrainians overall, not just unsuccessful, but in terms of the losses that they have suffered, straightforwardly disastrous. Will they try again? Almost certainly. Where? Perhaps again in this region, though they must be under no illusions now about the strength of Russian defenses in Belgorod and Kursk region. The Russians have clearly reinforced their defenses along the border since the events of last year. And, well, there is this alternative, this rather tantalizing alternative that various people at EBAR, the military summary channel, have been talking about some kind of Ukrainian operation across the Dnieper to try to capture the Kinburn Spit and islands on the Dnieper and effectively gain control of the mouth of the Dnieper on the Black Sea. And it's entirely plausible that an operation like that is coming. I would say that last night, the only operation across the Dnieper that I'm aware of, the only cross-Dnieper operation which took place, was not carried out by the Ukrainians against the Russians, but by the Russians against the Ukrainians. We have an account of it from our old friend, Vladimir Saldo, the governor of the Russian-controlled part of Kherson region. And this is what he has told us. He says that last night, a joint assault group of fighters from the Dnieper battle group carried out an audacious raid on the west bank of the Dnieper. Marine infantry personnel, paratroopers and volunteers disembarked from watercraft at the foot of the Antonovsky Bridge, in other words in Kherson city. The surprise effect disabled the enemy and prevented them from reacting in a timely way. Our fighters destroyed several enemy positions, including a drone control post and an electronics warfare station, observation, communications, and manpower temporary amassment sites. Ukrainian losses amounted to 30 troops. Our fighters returned to the East Bank without any irretrievable losses. And Saldo, very careful to say that the Russian assault force disembarked at the very same place where Soviet soldiers, commanded by Vasily Margelov, seized the first bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnieper River in 1944, which was key to breaching Germany's defences. So Russians always do want to bring us back to the events of the Second World War. Anyway, a daring commando raid by the Russians across the Dnieper, striking at the other end of the Antonovsky Bridge, of course, which the Russians themselves destroyed when they withdrew across the Dnieper, withdrew from Kherson region in the autumn of 2022. A daring commando raid, which, according to Saldo, resulted in no losses. Nobody was killed or severely wounded, but did result in significant damage being done to the Ukrainians, disrupting Ukrainian positions in the area and probably causing the Ukrainians a certain degree of disorganization. The Ukrainians will probably have to take steps to try to make sure that nothing like this happens in quite the same way again. Anyway, so that was one incident. Will there be later a Ukrainian attempt to cross the Dnieper further south, where, by the way, the Dnieper is at its widest, to capture the islands and the Spits at the mouth of the Dnieper? Quite possibly. All I would say about that is that the Russians, of course, are fully alerted about it. And to me, again, it looks like a pointless diversion and a likely sacrifice of more Ukrainian troops on an operation that would have more a publicity value than a military one. But, as we've discussed many times, Ukrainian military operations tend to be driven more, in many cases, more for their demonstration effect than for their actual military effect. And there are suggestions that just as the mastermind of the disastrous attack on Russian territory that was repelled yesterday was Kila Budanov, that it is also Kila Budanov who's coming up with his latest plan for Ukrainian operations at the mouth of the Dnieper and towards the Black Sea and ultimately Crimea. And of course, helpfully, he came himself to Kherson region a couple of days ago, made a very provocative speech saying that the Ukrainians were indeed planning some kind of operation in this area, in effect giving the whole game away. Now, there is one piece of news that has come through which perhaps does lend weight to the theory that some kind of operation at the mouth of the Dnieper is indeed being planned, which is that yesterday the United States, the Biden administration, confirmed that they were going to provide $300 million of extra military aid to Ukraine. Now, of course, this aid is not coming from any new appropriation. There's been no new appropriation authorized by Congress for many months now. The $61 billion package remains stuck in Congress. The latest word is that the Republicans are putting together their own counter-proposal, which converts some of this aid that the president has been asking for to give to Ukraine, converts it from a gift, in effect, to a loan, and also links, reestablishes the link with control of the US border and proposes various tough steps to bring the border situation back under control, which I suspect it would be very difficult politically for the president and his team to agree to. But anyway, the point is, we're now in the middle of March, and we still haven't got an appropriation authorized by Congress. But, as has happened before, the Biden administration has engaged in creative accountancy exercises. They've decided that they're going to mark down the value of some of the equipment that they've previously supplied to Ukraine, and as a result, they've given themselves, in effect, another $300 million. Now, I am not going to explore the legality of these creative accountancy exercises. I suspect that some people in Congress might not be entirely pleased that the Biden administration is engaging in these, shall we say, these devices, these accountancy devices. But the point is that the Biden administration has announced what it says is an emergency package of further military aid for Ukraine. And supposedly this is being done because of the desperate situation on the battle lines. And we're told that this aid will include Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, 155mm shells, further equipment for the HIMARS launch vehicles, that kind of thing. In reality, and this has been essentially confirmed by Politico, the true purpose of this package, and I discussed this actually myself, I anticipated this some days ago in another program. The real purpose of this package is to provide Ukraine with more ATACMS long-range missiles. Only it seems that these will not be, again, the really powerful missiles with the unitary warheads, the ones that Ukraine would want to use, for example, if they were going to attack the Kerch Bridge. But they might be the kind of missiles that Ukraine might need or want to use to support a complex amphibious operation on the mouth of the Dnieper River. Now, bear in mind that what has happened in the past is that the United States announces a military package, gives the impression that the equipment in the package will be supplied to Ukraine, when in fact, in reality, it has already been in Ukraine for some time. If we look at the previous ATACMS delivery, the Ukrainians used ATACMS missiles to strike at a Russian airbase in, I believe it was Berdyansk, I think that was the name of the town, in the autumn of last year. But it is widely suspected that the missiles had been delivered to Ukraine at least 2 months previously. I strongly suspect that these ATACMS missiles are already in Ukraine, waiting to be used by Budanov to conduct his operation on the mouth of the Dnieper River. And bear in mind also that recently all kinds of Western officials, important Western officials, have been touring this region. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock of Germany was there about 10 days ago. Greek Prime Minister Kostas Mitsotakis came to the same area, this time in the company of President Zelensky himself. And I wonder whether perhaps one of the reasons was that they were being given a presentation of the troops and of the plans for this operation at the mouth of the Dnieper. So perhaps we can expect this to happen at some point over the next few days. We'll just have to wait and see. As I said, the Russians are fully alerted about it. It's all over the internet. We'll see what the Russians have prepared and what they're going to do. But one way or the other, even if this operation succeeds in its own terms, it will be, or so it seems to me, an exercise more for its demonstrative effects than for its actual consequences. And of course, it risks leaving a significant number of Ukrainian troops potentially stranded on the east bank of the Dnieper, where they might find themselves facing the same fate as their comrades who established that bridgehead in Krinky. Anyway, let's wait and see what the Ukrainians do. We can do nothing more. It may be that something is coming, or perhaps not. Lastly, again, the Ukrainians have been publishing a large number of videos of various strikes near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It's been suggested that they might try something there again. I have to say that operation, to me, looks incredibly challenging. And once again, I'm sure that the Russians are alerted to it if it is indeed being planned. And I suspect that if it's carried out, it will fail disastrously. But anyway, we'll see what the Ukrainians are going to do. One way or the other, the Russian elections will take place on Sunday, as planned. And one way or the other, I confidently expect, as everybody in the world does, that President Putin will be re-elected, probably by a massive margin. And of course, the special military operation will continue as before. So overall, disastrous night for Ukraine, but it's highly likely that they will try something else. And, well, we'll see what it is that they do. Now, on the actual battlefront, the place where the fighting is really happening, the real battle is taking place, the situation continues to go for Ukraine from bad to worse. And it is increasingly being reported that the Ukrainian positions in the town of Pervomaisky, southwest of Avdiivka, and northwest of Nivolskoye, this village that the Russians captured yesterday, that the position of the Ukrainian troops there is becoming critical, and that the Ukrainians might be obliged to retreat from this town. Now, I've described Pervomaisky in the past as a village, but in fact that is not actually, properly speaking, what it is. It is actually a fairly substantial town. Before the war, it had a population of around 28,000 people. So this is a large place, about the same size as Avdiivka, which the Russians captured a few weeks ago, at the end of February, and twice the size of Krasnogorovka, which the Russians are in the process of attacking at the present time. The Russians apparently control already perhaps 50 to 60% of Pervomaisky. This is my own guesstimate, by the way, based on what I can make out of the various maps. Others might argue otherwise, but they've been gradually pushing the Ukrainians out of this town. This battle for Pervomaisky has never received the attention that perhaps it deserves. There was a time when it was seen as basically ancillary to the Battle of Avdiivka. I remember there were even some suggestions that the reason that the Russians were attacking Pervomaisky was in order to encircle the Ukrainian troops who were defending Avdiivka, which frankly hardly seems to be the case. As I said, we're talking about a substantial town. If the Russians capture it, they will have captured another significant town after Avdiivka. Avdiivka, population of around 32,000 before the war. Pervomaisky, 28,000 before the war. The war, by the way, the one that began not in 2022 but 2014. And obviously, if the fall of Pervomaisky leads to the fall of Krasnogorovka, again, that is not an insignificant place. It has a population of around 14,000 people, or at least did before the war began. Now, one of the reasons we've been hearing less about the battle for Pervomaisky is because the Russian war reporters have not been particularly interested in it. We've not been getting much film from the town itself. There are few reports of heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force of Ukrainian positions in Pervomaisky. It looks like this has been a steady, incremental advance by the Russians over the last few months through this small town. But anyway, it looks like that with the fall of Novoskoye, which apparently is on high ground and enables the Russians to look down upon Ukrainian positions in Pervomaisky, it looks as if the position of the Ukrainian troops in Pervomaisky is becoming critical. And there are also reports that with Novoskoye having fallen, even the Ukrainians can see that the situation of their troops further south in Krasnogorovka, the other fortified town near to Donetsk, that they're trying to retain, that the position of their troops there is becoming critical as well. And there are reports that all the senior officers have again been evacuated from Krasnogorovka, that now that the heavy equipment, the tanks and the armored vehicles are being withdrawn from Krasnogorovka as well. And there are even reports circulating today, which I think, by the way, are probably wrong, that the Ukrainians are starting to pull some of their troops out of Krasnogorovka as well. I suspect that with Zelensky and Syrsky in charge, it is much more likely that the Ukrainians will do that which they have always done, try to hold on to Krasnogorovka and indeed to Pervomaisky to the bitter end, even though with Novoskoye under their control, the Russians are now in a strong position to start cutting the supply lines both to Krasnogorovka and perhaps to Pervomaisky as well. I've discussed how this battle that is taking place is like a game of checkers, and we can see that with one important piece taken, Novoskoye, the Russians are able to increase the pressure on two others, Pervomaisky and Krasnogorovka, bigger places obviously by far than Novoskoye. And of course, it's quite possible, as often happens in checkers, that the Russians will soon be able to take two important places, Pervomaisky and Krasnogorovka. Well, let's not say exactly at once, but one soon after the other. In which case, as I said, the Ukrainians will have lost two more towns. Compare that, by the way, to what happened during Ukraine's Zaporozhye offensive, where the largest places that Ukraine was able to capture were small villages. Just saying. Anyway, that's a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. There has been less information from the front lines in Avdiivka, from the area of Tonenka Orlovka and Berdichi. The last report I heard, which was some days ago, was that the Russians are largely control Tonenka and Orlovka, and that they do control at least a significant part, maybe half of Berdichi. There are some reports that Syrskyi has been ordering more counterattacks by more Ukrainian troops in this area, that he's desperately trying to hold the line here. And that probably explains why this unstable front line is still in these three villages. Though, as I've discussed on several occasions, it does often happen that reports are behind events. For example, the capture of Novoskoye, we could see that it was coming. It was clear that the Russians were gradually advancing towards that particular village. But it happened, I think, a lot more suddenly than many people had anticipated. Meanwhile, there's also been a dearth of news from Bakhmut. We are not being kept up to date, including by the Russian Ministry of Defense, about what is actually happening there. There were reports a couple of days ago, about 2 days ago, that Ivanivska was about to fall. There were further reports, I think yesterday, that Ivanivska had indeed fallen. I mentioned that in the last Russian Defense Ministry update, providing us with an update of the situation on the battlefronts, the Russian Defense Ministry was no longer reporting news from the Bakhmut area, which, if one follows what happened in the Avdiivka area, would point to the imminent capture, perhaps of Ivanivska itself, and of an intensifying battle. It makes me wonder, by the way, whether the Russian Defense Ministry plans to keep silent about the fighting in Bakhmut, up to and including the eventual capture, not just of Ivanivska, but also of Chasiv Yar. Just saying. But anyway, it looks as if a lot more fighting is taking place there as well. But the major drama at the moment appears to be happening around these two towns of Krasnogorovka and Pervomaisky. And just to reiterate again, once these two towns are captured, with Avdiivka also captured, the area beyond suddenly becomes less dense with buildings, and houses, and small towns, and small cities. The maneuver space for the Russians becomes much greater, even as the Russians have secured aerial superiority, which means that they would presumably be in a strong position to cause devastating damage to Ukrainian formations in the fields and forests, trying to hold back the Russians in this area. Anyway, that's the situation in those places. There's also reports that the Russians have made further advances in the north around the village of Terny, and there has been a fair amount of reports from the Zaporozhye region. Saldo yesterday was saying that the Russians have made further progress in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, and we'll just have to see. Again, there were claims yesterday that the Russians are now once again in consolidated control of the greater part of Rabotino. Well, we'll have to again wait to see what is happening. But overall, the situation remains very bleak. There have been two very interesting reports which have been circulating over the last couple of days about the state of the Ukrainian military. Um, Firstly, there's been a report in Der Spiegel, Ukrainian commanders reporting that they're almost out of ammunition, that they're desperately short of men, that they're desperately short of equipment altogether, that they're only just about managing to hold on, that the Russian pressure is growing all the time, that they doubt that they can continue to withstand this pressure for very much longer. They put it at weeks or months at the most before the front lines collapse, and that basically they're improvising and struggling to hold their positions in the meantime. And there has been an even more interesting, in fact, a very striking report indeed from France. And these were provided, details of these reports were provided by a French newspaper called Marianne. Marianne, by the way, is the embodiment of France. She was created, she was imagined at roughly the time of the French Revolution. There's a statue of her on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which she appears to be calling on her, on the people of France to defend France. And it's been suggested that the way that her mouth is configured, she's crying aux armes citoyens, to armed citizens, a line from the Marseillaise. Just saying. So this is clearly a patriotic newspaper, Marianne, and it's provided us with 3 internal French military reports which have apparently reached Sarkozy himself and which came on his desk and which Marianne is saying partly explain all the panic that we have been seeing from France, from Macron, over the last few weeks, and which triggered his sudden demands for French troops to be sent to Ukraine. Now, these 3 reports are quite extensive, and they're in French, but Arnaud Bertrand has provided us with a summary which he's published on Twitter X, and which I now propose to read. He says that the situation looks exceedingly bleak for Ukraine. A Ukrainian military victory now seems impossible. Marianne itself consulted various French soldiers. They say that Ukraine's counteroffensive of the summer gradually bogged down in mud and blood and did not result in any strategic gain. Its planning, conceived by Kiev and Western general staffs, turned out to be disastrous. Planners thought that once the first Russian defense lines were reached, the entire front would collapse. These fundamental preliminary phases were conducted without considering the moral force of the enemy in defense. That is the will of the Russian soldier to hold on to the terrain. The report also highlights, this is all from Monsieur Bertrand, the inadequacy of the training of Ukrainian soldiers and officers due to a lack of officers and combat veterans. Year 2 soldiers, that's to say soldiers trained in 2023, were often trained for no more than 3 weeks, were launched into an assault on a Russian fortified line that proved impregnable, without air support, with disparate Western equipment that was less efficient than the old Soviet material. Interesting admission. We're told that this old Soviet material was obsolete, easy to maintain, and capable of being used in a degraded mode, which tells us that it is more battle-worthy than these over-engineered and over-sophisticated Western equipment with which Ukraine was lumbered. But anyway, that's a matter to discuss another day. The Ukrainian troops had no hope of breaking through. Added to this was Russian super dominance in the field of electronic jamming, penalizing on the Ukrainian side the use of drones and command systems. And then we had some very interesting additions about the Russians. The Russian army today is the tactical and technical reference for thinking and implementing the defensive mode. In other words, the Russians are the best in the world on how to conduct a defense. Not only does Moscow have heavy engineering equipment that allowed it to construct defensive works, and the reports speak of an almost total absence of this material on the Ukrainian side and the impossibility for Westerners to supply it quickly. That's exactly what was pointed out to me by a member of the Duran community about a week ago, and it was also confirmed by the Ukrainian commentator Yuri Butusov, who is, shall we say, deeply scathing about the various claims by the Ukrainians to be creating fortified lines. But anyway, the French reports go on to say that the 1,200 kilometer front, known as the Surovikin line, had been mined to a huge extent. And then it talks about the condition of the Russian army itself, contrary to what the Ukrainians had been claiming. The Russians have managed their reserve troops well to ensure operational endurance. Moscow reinforces its units before they're completely worn out, mixes recruits with experienced troops, ensures regular rest periods in the rear, and always has a coherent reserve force to manage unforeseeable events. And Monsieur Bertrand makes the point that this is far from the widespread idea in the West of a Russian army sending its troops to slaughter without counting, which is absolutely true. And then the French reports continue. To date, the Ukrainian General Staff does not have a critical mass of land forces capable of combined arms maneuver at the core level, which are capable of challenging their Russian counterparts to break through its defense lines. The gravest error of analysis and judgment would be to continue to seek exclusively military solutions to the hostilities. And those words are given to Marianne by a French officer. It is clear, given the forces present, that Ukraine cannot win this war militarily. And we're told that the conflict, this is again from the confidential French reports, the conflict entered a critical phase in December. The combativeness of Ukrainian soldiers is deeply affected. Zelensky needs 35,000 men per month. He's not recruiting half of that, while Putin draws from a pool of 30,000 volunteers a month. And that's said by a military officer who has just returned from Kiev. In terms of equipment, the balance is just as unbalanced. The failed offensive of 2023 tactically destroyed half of Ukraine's 12 combat brigades. And the level of Western aid is low. The West can supply 3D printers to manufacture drones or loitering munitions, but cannot print men. Given the situation, it may have been decided to strengthen the Ukrainian army, not with fighters, but with support forces in the rear, allowing Ukrainian soldiers to be freed up for the front, admits a senior officer, confirming a ramp-up of Western military personnel in civilian clothes. Besides the Americans who allowed the New York Times to visit a CIA camp, there are quite a few Britons, slips a military officer who does not deny the presence of French special forces, notably combat swimmers, for training missions. And it's been suggested, by the way, that this admission that more and more of the logistics and infrastructure work is being done by Westerners is the origin point of Macron's idea of sending French troops to Ukraine. I think that is unlikely by myself. I think that what is being discussed about the actual situation is different, significantly different from what Macron is proposing, which is a public deployment of French military units. This is all about Western service personnel in civilian clothes conducting infrastructure work in Ukraine's rear. That's been going on for a long time. Anyway, going back to the report, we're then told that then a long discussion about the Battle of Avdiivka, which has clearly dismayed the French. They talk about the contrast between a 155mm artillery shell, which carries 7 kilos of explosive, whereas Russian glided bombs deliver between 200 and 700 kilos of explosive apiece. I've been discussing how recently the discussion about ammunition, in which the West is already being overtaken, has been overtaken, is becoming overtaken by the massive Russian use of glided bombs, which are gaining in size and power all the time. The French then go on to say that the Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka were taken by surprise. They admit that the Ukrainians were losing around 1,000 men a day in the battle. Corroboration, by the way, of Russian claims, just saying, Russian casualty estimates. And the reports go on to say that the Ukrainian armed forces have shown that they do not possess the human and material capabilities to hold a sector of the front that is subjected to the assailants' efforts. The Ukrainian failure in Avdiivka shows that despite the emergency deployment of an elite brigade, the 3rd Azov Air Assault Brigade, Kiev is not capable of restoring a sector of the front that collapses. And then there's speculation about what the Russians will do, whether they're will continue nibbling and slowly shaking the entire front line, or whether they will seek to break through in depth. The terrain behind Avdiivka makes the last possible, that the West should not underestimate the Russians, who are very skilled at the practice of maskirovka, appearing weak when they are strong. And the report then apparently concludes, according to this summary, after 2 years of war, Russian forces have shown their ability to develop operational endurance that allows them to wage a slow and long intensity war based on continuous attrition of the Ukrainian army. Well, everything that you have seen in these French reports is not so very different. In fact, it's not at all different from what I, Brian Valetic, Daniel Davis, lots of others who've been commenting and discussing about the war have been saying for a long, long time. This is the Russians have chosen to fight this war as a war of attrition. They're doing it with skill, and they're achieving their objectives. The Ukrainian forces are indeed being steadily and methodically ground down. And the Ukrainians are becoming weaker all the time, even as the Russians are becoming stronger all the time. And adventures, like whatever adventure it is that Budanov is planning on the mouth of the Dnieper, are not capable of changing that calculus. And as the Russians, moreover, grind the Ukrainian forces down, we've seen how they're able to use checkerboard tactics to, as they like to say, improve their tactical position and to advance their objectives overall. Now, I'm going to briefly return to the whole Macron introduction of combat troops to Ukraine discussion. I had a number of emails from a member of the Duran community, who is, I should say, somebody who served in a Western military. I'm not going to say which one. He has discussed. He says, amongst other things, that I underestimate the danger of this affair, which, by the way, is not the case at all. He points out that the West does have a significant air superiority over the Russians in Europe, a very significant air superiority overall. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, by the way. He seems to think that the Western powers would be deploying their entire air forces in Ukraine if it came to a shooting war there with the Russians. Whereas, of course, the Russians, who have a very significant air force and, of course, air defense system, would be able to counter that. But the most interesting part of his emails is that he is discussing the only way in which a Western military operation in Ukraine, or so it seems to me, could succeed. He talks about a massive US-led air campaign bombing Russian troops in Ukraine, apparently for some weeks before ground combat were to start. And, of course, he raises the possibility that the Russians might be obliged to counter that through the use of nuclear weapons in order to offset the American superiority in air power. Now, what I'm going to say about that is this. First of all, I think that it is absolutely clear, and I've made this point in many, many programs, it is absolutely unrealistic for the Europeans to consider seriously a military campaign in Ukraine without the Americans. And these emails confirm that fact. I've always said that the only way in which any kind of military campaign by the Western powers in Ukraine could realistically happen would be if the Americans were fully on board with it. So, minus the Americans, the French, the Germans, the British are no match for the Russians on Ukrainian territory. And these emails, to my mind, show the extent to which that is so. But of course, we come immediately up against the problem, because it turns out that even if the Americans were to become involved, they would have no choice, if you follow the logic set out in these emails, which I think is sound, they would have no choice other than to engage the Russians in the air, taking, I suspect, significant losses. The Russian Air Force is not to be discounted, and the Russian air defense system, the most advanced and sophisticated and powerful in the world, also is not to be discounted. Anyway, the Americans would have to conduct a sophisticated and massive air operation, probably much bigger than the one we saw in the two wars against Iraq. operating their expensive stealth fighter jets, and this would have to continue for several weeks. Well, to me, this looks like the first big battle, and it'd be a big battle, of World War III. I think it is inconceivable if we were involved in an operation like that nuclear weapons at some point would not be used. We would be looking at an air war between the United States and Russia, the world's largest country, with vast opportunities to husband air assets across its vast territory, and with enormous capabilities in hypersonic and missile warfare. But also, of course, more importantly, even if the Americans were to prevail in the air war, which perhaps in time they would, also by far the biggest, well, not by far, but the biggest nuclear power in the world. And of course, the Russians have just demonstrated their prowess in this. They've just test launched another Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, the most powerful intercontinental ballistic missiles in the world. Putin has told us that the avant-garde glide vehicles are now in operation. And anyway, this would be an absolutely unimaginable exercise. And of course, it goes without saying that before the United States were able to conduct an operation of this kind, the administration would need authorization from Congress. I think this would be true. In fact, I definitely think it would be true, even if in some complex way, Article 5 of the Washington Treaty were to be invoked. At the time when the Washington Treaty was ratified, back in the 1940s, the Truman administration actually gave assurances to Congress that its authority, its sole authority to authorize military action in the form of a declaration of war, had not been ousted. Just saying. So Congress would certainly have to be brought on board, and of course, so would the American people, who would undoubtedly have their own opinion about lurching into what to me looks like World War III on behalf of Ukraine. So yes, I agree, this is very dangerous. All this talk by people like Macron is incredibly dangerous indeed. But is the United States, are the American people, is the American political class, is the Pentagon really prepared to risk World War III by launching an operation of this kind? Is it really happy to be dragged by its European allies into a World War III type scenario? I cannot believe this. In fact, what these emails have done is that they've, if anything, reinforced my belief that a Western military operation in Ukraine is unlikely. Now, John Helmer has written another outstanding piece about the war. He says that the Russians themselves now are increasingly confident that the battle for Ukraine east of the Dnieper has been all but won. There will be several more months, perhaps a year, of sorting things out, but ultimately Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper are now well on the process to being destroyed. But that the Russians are thinking that the next phase of the war, if there is a next phase of the war, west of the Dnieper, might be a more complex and difficult operation, though that will depend very much on what the West chooses to do. Well, based on these emails, I would have thought that if the Western powers are wise, they would not overcommit to Ukraine. It looks to me that if they send troops into Ukraine, the Russians have already made it clear that as far as they're concerned, those troops are targets wherever in Ukraine they are. The Russians have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to reach every part of Ukraine. They now have apparently not just Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, but Zircon hypersonic missiles coming on stream. We don't know the quantities of these missiles, but likely production is being given priority. There is no defense to these missiles, and of course the state of Western militaries, especially the European militaries, is very poor, and the United States anyway has lots of other commitments. I think I have to say this, that any Western military involvement anywhere in Ukraine looks to me like a disastrous investment in which the United States, which is the only power that really matters, whatever government leads it, would ultimately have to make a disastrous strategic choice between either of total retreat, such as we saw in Vietnam in the 1970s, with a complete collapse, or alternatively, as I've discussed, scenarios which would take us almost certainly into a kind of World War III situation. I can't quite imagine that even with the current administration, we're going to get there. I think that there'll be a lot of talk and a lot of discussion, but in the end, there will be some more supplies sent to Ukraine, but Western armies pouring into Ukraine, it won't happen. That's my guess. Anyway, we will have to wait and see whether or not I am right. I go back to what that French officer said to Marianne, the one piece of exceptionally good sense that was provided. The gravest error of analysis and judgment would be to continue to seek exclusively military solutions to stop the hostilities. It is clear, given the forces present, that Ukraine cannot win this war militarily. I can well imagine that if Macron was receiving advice like that, given the volatile person he is, he will have panicked and started saying all sorts of foolish and absurd things. People who are certainly brought up to face with reality have a tendency to do that. But rather than go down these disastrous paths, sending troops to Ukraine, imagining great clashes of air forces over Ukraine, surely negotiations is the more rational way to go. Maybe the West won't do that. The alternative will be one in which, as Jake Sullivan no less said, the Russians win the war and dictate terms. That's my video for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things there, links under the video also. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.